So one of the main things that the Park District wanted us to investigate is the effect of management on some of these native species. And we started off the project investigating both grazing, which the park leases out its land for grazing both by cattle and sheep, depending on the park. We were also looking at fire, but the difficulty of using prescribed burns is so significant that that was mostly that as a management treatment was mostly not conducted or implemented, and so we don't have that much to say about fire, but we do have some stuff to say about grazing. So, and David should correct me if I've got this chronology wrong, but Vasco Caves used to be cattle grazed. It was cattle grazed probably for a good century or so, up until shortly before the Park District acquired the land. After the Park District acquired the land, it was observed that a lot of the bunch grasses seemed to, or that there were supposed to be bunch grasses here, but they weren't very evident. And so it was suggested that grazing be resumed in Vasco Caves, and so sheep were brought on. So sheep have been grazing Vasco Caves now for probably about 15 or 20 years, is that right? Is somebody from the district here who can confirm that? Yeah? Yeah, so, well, it's at least 10, yeah, but yeah, so about 10, 15 years. Initially it looked as though those areas that were grazed, you could really see the bunch grasses really well. So then we thought we'd better actually put in some comparison plots where we actually excluded sheep and saw and looked to see what happened to the native perennials. And specifically, it's purple needlegrass is the native species that we're following most closely at Vasco Caves. So what we did is we used the shepherd who runs the sheep here used electric fences to keep sheep out of some of our plots. And then we followed those plots through time from year to year. And so this is one of the plots that actually has been ungrazed now for about 5 years or so. I think it stopped being grazed in 2005, and previous to that it was grazed by sheep for a few years. And interestingly, by and large, we had really high levels of purple needlegrass on this hillside, despite the fact that it was grazed. We have a grazed plot, ungrazed. We have a grazed plot just across the way, and then most of the other areas we have an almost balanced design now. We have about as many ungrazed plots as grazed plots, but only a few of those plots actually have large populations of purple needlegrass on them. So we've never really been able to pull out a strong signal of grazing on purple needlegrass. It seems likely that other factors really come into play on determining what the cover of purple needlegrass is in this area of Vasco, in Vasco Caves, and probably elsewhere as well. We hypothesize that it's likely to be weather patterns. The weather patterns are driving the cover.
Question was, Dr. Bartolome, hazard a guess. What percentage of the interannual variation is due to weather versus management?
So, from other studies that we've done, manipulating RDM on different sites under different weather patterns, if you take out the effects of the combined effects of weather and site, you're left with about 40% of the variation left, which means that let's just think of how much does this vary in total. 60% is the combination of site and weather interacting. 40% is left over for everything else. So that could include residual random effects and management. My guess would be that the management side, either management of grazing or management of residual dry matter, is down around 20 to 30% of the total influence. Now, don't despair, because that's not bad. That's not an insignificant effect. But that's one of the things that I'd really like to get across today, is that because of this non-equilibrium type system, you're stuck with this variability that is not subject to control. That doesn't mean you can't control the other part, but you have to put it in this right perspective, that you're going to get these other influences first, and and that limits the amount of things you can do with management. It doesn't make management irrelevant, but it's what I said, I was a cautionary tale here. This is to caution you that you don't want to expect too much out of management in these kinds of systems. And we've grown to expect a lot out of these kinds of systems because a lot of the examples we have for grazing are things like the effects on irrigated pasture, the effects on highly productive perennial dominated pastures in the Midwest. And when those principles are applied to California systems, it's not that grazing management is irrelevant, it's just that its relative role goes down in relation to these uncontrollable factors.
So the question was, did the other plants on this most abundant native plants of Vasco Caves list, did they show similar patterns of fluctuation to Nacella pulchra, to purple needlegrass? And the answer is yes. In fact, in some ways, even more so. A lot of these are native forbs, and forbs tend to fluctuate even more than, and a lot of them are annual forbs. And so sometimes they just don't appear in a year with bad rainfall, although obviously they're present in the soil as seeds. Whereas, most of these mature Nacella pulchra plants probably are still alive. They may be somewhat dormant, and maybe that accounts for this fluctuation in cover. They don't put up that many leaves in one particular year that's dry, say, and that's why we notice this fluctuation. But yeah, they definitely fluctuate. And as you can see, purple needlegrass is by far the most abundant native compared to all the other ones. And even still, it's still overall over this entire area just a minuscule proportion of the actual plant cover, less than 1%, right? It tends to be somewhat different, but nonetheless they found that grazing was associated with higher abundance of forbs. Is that a
higher diversity and abundance of native annual
forbs, right? Yeah, okay. And so we thought we would look at our data sets and sort of copy their idea of looking for that effect. And what we found, again, it seemed to be site dependent. In some places where there was an abundance of annual native forb species, we found that grazing did seem to have an effect, that there seemed to be more, although not necessarily hugely large amount more, but there did seem to be more, both greater cover, which suggests greater abundance, and greater species richness, in other words, the number of native forbs in grazed areas. In other locations, we didn't find that relationship at all. We usually found that there wasn't a relationship. It didn't seem to matter, and that's especially where you have areas with very low numbers of native species. It doesn't matter whether they're grazed or not, there's just not very many native species there. I mean, in general, in these grasslands, looking at them as a whole, typically cover of non-native species is really high, as you would expect. So we often get values above 90% cover of non-natives. That's the norm. But if you look at the species richness, often actually the species richness is about half and half native and non-native. It's just that in terms of cover, in terms of dominance of the area, the natives win out.
When you think about how research and science can contribute, there's places where science, I think, can contribute good information, and there's places where it can't. So on the areas of what's the potential for this kind of a site, what's the potential vegetation here, and the levels of production that you can expect, how does weather affect production, and then a general question about how does grazing, either grazing or no grazing, have a general effect on composition. Those are the kinds of things that we can do through an observational experiment or what you call a semi-controlled, a controlled observation study, which is what this is. If you want to get at the details of how much to graze, when to graze, and how to do it, that's one where I think it's much better to do it as adaptive management, where you'd have people apply their grazing practices and monitor it closely to see what happens after those are actually done. And I think that's a better approach than doing the experimental approach. So if we had the money and the inclination and the time to do that, we could get a much better handle on things like, well, how are sheep actually affecting purple needlegrass? What's the differences between cattle and sheep? If we went to the variety of different kinds of management practices that the district is applying, follow those more closely with monitoring targeted at that objective. That's the way I would do it. rather than trying to, controlled experiments are very difficult to do with grazing because they involve limited treatments that are applied uniformly. That's not the way grazing is practiced. Grazing is adaptable, flexible, and designed for a whole series of different purposes with adjustments made on what what the manager is observing over time. So I think that's where the two things diverge. You're much better off doing it observationally.